Hello, Lothar here. This is a video on advice and information and various sources you might look at. Not sticking on the online ones, there's loads of them. Lots of differing opinions, lots of different views. Some are commercially linked, some are neutral, and some are not for profit like charities. So take your pick. I would advise you to look at more than one, and I tend to look at 3 or 4 different ones, all of which coming from different angles. But there's lots of differing opinions, lots of backstabbing between so-called experts. These are people who've been around the thing for years. So if you think the PCT community is beautiful and harmonious, I'd like to think it is. Trail angels, it normally is. But yeah, when the commercial angles creep in and people are fighting for position and making sure their message is heard, but ultimately they're trying to sell something, then sometimes the market economy and the pressures of the market economy creep in, and so yes, there's ultimate competition for online coverage and audience. I have no commercial interest whatsoever. I do this for fun. I do this for my friends and family. So if you're on trail, where do you get advice? Well, historically they used to have events like trail days. Now these were like 0-day trail days, I think, events where at Lake Morena you would see lots of stalls over a long weekend. I think it was mid-season normally, for a couple of days, and this is where companies would come in, have stalls. You'd have the Wolverines, which are like hikers who would come in and help new hikers with their gear, like doing shakedowns. There'd be trail angels there giving advice. There'd be a local forestry service and things like that. So always wonderful events that just basically do a nice kickoff. And what would traditionally happen is hikers on trail would hitch back to attend that event, or new hikers would maybe arrive early so they could attend that event. Sadly, that event no longer runs. Other things that happened historically, there used to be at mile 40 at Mount Laguna a gear shop, and regularly I would be driving past and you'd see hikers getting gear shakedowns from the staff at the store. That was a great facility. Sadly, that store no longer operates, so you've lost that facility. Scout and Frodo. Now these are traditionally angels that open up their house to hikers, so they could have basically a couple of days as they arrive in San Diego, get their gear ready, have safety talks from Scout and Frodo, and then ultimately get a lift to the trail. Now at the start of 2022, Scout and Frodo were not offering they were not opening up their house, but since then, mid-season, I think they've opened it up for a month. And I think they're allowing 20 hikers to stay with them, which is great, which is fantastic. It's a fantastic facility. But what it also means is that for the first, what it meant was for the first month of the trail, there was no source of advice, either from the being able to stay at Scout and Frodo's, or a store at Mount Laguna, which is now closed, or Trail Days, which no longer exists. The new kid on the block, which is a very good one, is Cleef. Now, Cleef is an equestrian centre at mile 0.8. It is a facility whereby they've given the PCT Trail Angels, like Legend and some of his team, the ability to actually host hikers at Cleef, and this year they've also started to open a hostel, which is fantastic. So this was where I benefited last year, because I was able to camp the night before I started my PCT through hike. Met Legend, learned all about what they were doing, and this year it's expanded, and the jobs that Cleef are doing in association with Legend are fantastic. They've now got a full hostel. It's donation based. They have safety talks, advice, or giving advice if it's wanted, and although it's at mile 0.8, that is literally the only place on trail where you can get advice. So I think there was some opposition that getting advice at mile 0.5 or 0.8 is too early. Well, guess what? There's nowhere else on the trail to get it. So I suggest hikers, if you're arriving for the first time, you've got lots of questions, pop into Cleef, talk to Legend and his team. They're very experienced. They're actually on the ground. They've got the weather reports. They've got the water reports. If you're planning your strategy from Campo to Lake Morena, which is the first section, it can be a very hot section. So it's a great opportunity to talk through your water strategy, talk through the time of day you're starting, talk through how many days you plan to take to get to Lake Morena, run past your strategy, your water strategy with some of the team, and they can give feedback and advice, but ultimately the decision is yours, the responsibility is yours. But if you've got a team on the ground, swallow your pride and get advice. I would. I've been hiking for 35 years. Next thing, I'm just looking at my list here. Yeah, the reason why it's probably good to get advice this year and probably future years is it is getting warmer, and the number of rescues that have occurred so far, people either running out of water, pressing the red button, SOS button, having injuries, being overloaded, is increasing and has increased this year, and we're not even in May yet. So yeah, you can take advice online or you can talk to people on the ground, and my advice is talk to people on the ground. Next thing, oh yes, I spent some time at Lake Morena, which is the first stop, and it was a great opportunity to just help out with the rangers, some of the stuff on hiker box, set that up, which was great. They've got a great facility there, and also just talk to the hikers and what was their experiences. And not surprisingly, a lot of the hikers reported that the heat was far hotter than they anticipated. These are people like myself who originally were not from hot climates, so hiking in the desert for the first time can be a real shock and not to be underestimated. So if you have any questions, ask the guys in the Cleef. Other things they reported. Oh yes, the reason why it's a surprise actually when they're talking about heat in the desert is a lot of people were surprised how cold it gets desert temperatures, because at night, because obviously you have a clear sky, that means you get potentially frosts early in the morning, and a lot of people were suffering from condensation and finding out that maybe their 30-degree quilt or 20-degree quilt wasn't enough to keep them warm. Good time to learn about it in the first couple of days. So that was a surprise. So don't underestimate how hot and how cold the desert can get. So again, if you're thinking of dropping your puffy until you get to the Sierras, might want to think again. But at least you can maybe try it for a couple of days, see if you need it in the early mornings. I carry my puffy all the way from Campo to Canada, never regretted it. Yeah, anyway, you've got to make your own decisions. I'm looking at my list again. What else? Just bear with me. Oh yes, some of the common issues that hikers faced when they got to Lake Morena. The first one, which was actually a surprise, was the number of people who had problems with their water filters. So specifically the Sawyer Squeeze water filter. Now these are hollow fibre filters, and the problems people were having were, it wasn't with the brand new filters, it was where they maybe used the filter for a trip a couple of weeks before and let the filter dry out. So what actually happened is the hollow fibres had probably just collapsed. If there's any slight residual like calcium carbonate from any hard water you might have put through it, it basically just, the fibres had just bonded together and just dried out. So when you came to try and filter and push water through it, it was just basically clogged, and you got next to nothing through it. So what I think I've done 32 or 33 filters now is I get a syringe, basically it's a Sawyer Squeeze syringe, and basically back flush it, which is the normal process. But I'd normally start with just warm water. So the idea of heat, of just exposing the tips of the fibres in the back flush, using a syringe, I'd just inject water into the filter, and the warm water would help dissolve any residual mineral deposits you might have had in the filter. Now, most filters, unless, as I said, you're using it in hard water conditions, which normally is tap water, then you probably don't need to go as far as using vinegar. But if it's really clogged, some people say use vinegar. But all the filters I used, as I said, more than 30, we've recovered them just by using warm water and just slowly injecting, using the syringe from back flushing through the flow, the reverse flow of the Sawyer Squeeze. And after a number 3 or 4 different pushes, you get slowly the flow rate would increase, and slowly it would come unclogged, and we pretty much got it back to 90% functionality. So yeah, that was after fishing out 3 or 4 filters for people have put in the dustbin or trash can, thinking that the filters actually failed. They just needed a little bit of TLC, or tender loving care, as we say. But yes, just test your filters before you get on trail. Do it at Cleef. I'm publishing Cleef. I have no vested interest in Cleef. I just think what they're doing is a very good job, and in the absence of any other support, full time on trail, I mean, then they're the best choice. Other things people reported, tents, yes. A lot of people had flooded tents early on. Now, we did have a couple of rainstorms, but we also had a lot of cold nights, so they also were flooded from condensation. Basically, your breath condenses on the roof of a cold fabric of your tent. What most tents, certainly like the Z-Packs and the Hyperlights, and it's not the Hyperlights, the top tents and things like that, if you make sure that the tent walls are taut, then any moisture that collects normally would run down and drip off the mesh and not into your basin of your tent. That only works if your tent is pitched correctly, and a lot of hikers were pitching their tents probably for the first or second time, and they basically had saggy tents. So ultimately that meant that a lot of them in the early days had lots of moisture, and in some cases when there's a rainstorm, literal puddles of water under their thermarest. So practice pitching your tent if you've got a chance, but also make sure you're pitching it taut and correctly, and also expect, if you're using say like a fabric tent, like a nylon tent or steel nylon tent, when they get wet, and same with the guy ropes, they tend to, as they soak up water, they tend to stretch slightly. So don't be surprised in a rainstorm you might have to get up in the middle of the night to retension your tent. Otherwise, again, you very run the risk of getting a nice big puddle under your sleeping mat. But it does happen, and it happens quite a lot. So yeah, just get your tent pitching right. And if you're in a situation where it's a really bad rainstorm, you'll see a lot of hikers putting rocks on their tent pegs. That's not only just to keep the pegs down, but it's also to stop the pegs, as the ground obviously soaks up water, and if it's sand, it sort of the tension in the way the peg is driven into the ground becomes much looser. The rock helps stabilize it a bit longer, so hopefully you don't have to get out in the middle of the night and readjust your tent pegs again. Other things we found early on was people still hadn't downloaded Guttux. Well, they bought it, but they hadn't necessarily downloaded the maps or the section maps, and probably a large number of people also hadn't downloaded the offline maps. Now these are the maps that you basically can select, such that when you're offline, you can have topographical maps with basically the contours, so you can see altitude and things like that. So make sure you've downloaded not just the individual sections, but also in those individual sections you've downloaded the optional topographical maps, or whichever offline maps you want to use. Now, if you've completely screwed up and you've forgotten to do that, you have one saving grace in that at Lake Morena, at the malt shop, they have extremely fast Wi-Fi, probably the fastest Wi-Fi I've ever seen. Shush, don't tell anybody. But yeah, very good. So if you screwed up and forgotten to download things, that's a great place to do it. Other things, Guttux, Garmin InReach. So if you've got the Explorer Plus, which is the big unit with the displays, make sure you download the maps, make sure you've set up your account, make sure you've set up preset messages, and make sure you've set up the phone numbers or emails that you want the messages to be sent to, and you've actually tested it. Now with the Mini, it's a bit more fiddly. It's probably more important to make sure you've set that up, because it's very difficult to try and set it up and access your account on trail if you haven't done already, and a couple of people had to do that. And again, the malt shop at Lake Morena is one saving grace where you have an opportunity to possibly do that. I'm just looking in finally. All camp fees. Yes, right. You have a PCT permit, or you may be doing local permits, but let's assume you have a PCT long distance permit. That doesn't mean you can camp anywhere. It does mean you can disperse camp. But if you come into a registered, established campground where you can maybe see fire pits, I'm sitting in one right now, you might see places where you sit down, you might see pit toilets, they normally have a fee associated with it. Now, what happens is, because these parks are visited by normally people in cars and RVs, the pay station associated with it, or all the signage for the fact you've got to pay, is at the entrance to the campground, not necessarily where you hike into the campground off trail. So it is your responsibility to ultimately wander down to the start of a campground, the road entrance, and see what the pay station rules are, rather than just pitch a tent and assume you can camp for free. Because if it's an established campground, unless there's a camp host that actually says, no, that is a free area for PCT hikers, unless somebody says that to you, or there's a clear sign saying so, then you can assume a fee normally applies. So please, Lake Morena is a $5 fee. You pay it overnight. You pay it if you're staying overnight. At at Boulder Oaks there's a fee. Now I think that this year, the camp hosts have sectioned off one area for PCT hikers, but again, check with them. At the next campground up, which is Sibbots Flats, there's a fee of $14 per site, but you can have up to 8 people on it. And at Burnt Ranchita, which is a much larger campground up at Mount Laguna, there are fees associated with that. So don't assume you can just camp for free. You can disperse camp for free, but make sure that you're not disperse camping on an established campground. It's common sense, so please, if these fees are actually servicing the pit toilets and all the facilities and paying people on to come and look after the site. So if you're going to stay there and you're going to use the facilities, then expect to pay a fee. And right, that's saying the bleeding obvious, but a lot of people haven't been doing that. So one last thing is resupplying food. a common, not mistake, but a common issue seems to be that people are arriving at Lake Morena, which is off 20 miles, with massive amounts of food, and they just end up dumping a lot of it. So I think the anticipation is that they've got to carry huge amounts of food from the start, which is not necessary, because you've got a resupply station at Lake Morena. You may want to carry 1 or 2 days food, depending on what your strategy is from Campo to Lake Morena. I carried 1.5 days food, and then I had a resupply at Lake Morena. Now, you may want, if you've got special dietary requirements, you might want to carry 3 or 4 days food, because that gets you up toward Mount Laguna. But I would try and keep the weight as low as possible on food, because your biggest priority is actually making sure you've got enough water, certainly for that first 20 miles, to make sure you're getting used to the desert heat, and you're not overloaded with too much food. The other thing to think about is you've probably got a 2-day stint, 1 or 2 day stint to Lake Morena. You've probably got a 1, 2, or depending how fast you are, 3-day stint up to Mount Laguna, so Lake Morena to Mount Laguna. Then you have a big decision point, because you can resupply at Mount Laguna from the store there, but if you're going to decide to go into Julian, which is at mile 77, which is 30 miles down the trail, you might have, say, 2 days or 3 days food. But if you want to go further and bypass Julian, then you might want to send yourself a resupply package to Mount Laguna, which is what I did, and bypass Julian and go on to Montezuma Valley or Warner Springs. So lots of choices, but I think on the first day you don't need to be carrying massive amounts of food from the Campo to Lake Morena section. Because then you get a good sense of how much food you need, how much water you need, and then you can plan your steps up to Mount Laguna and maybe Julian, Montezuma Valley and Warm Springs and Idlewild, with much more well-informed basically information about how your body is performing and what you need. So okay, I will stop there for the moment. I've got some more videos coming. Hope this is useful. I'm going to be doing more sections over the summer. Probably going to do a couple of long sections as well. But if I meet you on trail, great. If I don't, I wish you all the best. Hope you have as much fun as I did last year. Hope you can stay ahead of any new fires, which I think is probably the bigger risk, rather than necessarily a sudden dumping of snow. But you never know. Probably 2 weeks' time, we get a massive report of massive dumping of snow. That's fate. But yeah, I think most of the issues now are going to be dealing with staying ahead of the fires, get through the Sierras as quickly as you can, in a safe manner, and then just getting through North California and into Oregon before any risk of new fires starting become a problem and may causing you to do reroutes. But fingers crossed that won't happen. So all right, speak to you soon, and as I said, I've got a few more videos coming. Hope they're useful to you. Speak to you soon.